I want to start just by thanking the Johnston Institute for the opportunity to talk with you today about my research. And I look forward to what I hope will be a lively discussion about some rather difficult issues. As Andra said, I was a fellow at the Institute 10 years ago during its inaugural year. And during that time, some of what I worked on actually was the final stages of the book I co-edited with Clarence Lang, which was published in May 2009 at the end of my year here. I also wrote an article on Lorraine Hansberry's abiding concerns about peace issues, which I called Measure Them Right, which some of you will recognize as a line from Raisin in the Sun. People had written about a lot of her politics, but hadn't focused on her intense concerns about peace issues. And since then, my research has continued to focus on African-American peace advocacy and the uses of anti-communism to try to suppress that advocacy. So I'm going to give a brief overview of that work here and actually conclude with some remarks about where we are today. So I'll get past the 1970s. And some of this work is published, some of it is still in progress. The only other preface I want to say is that I define peace very broadly, relying on Martin Luther King's notion that peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of justice. So you need to remember that as we go along. So in 1957, Dr. King visited Highlander School, an important training ground in the South for labor and civil rights organizers. The headline over that widely disseminated photograph, which was aimed at discrediting King's nascent leadership of the civil rights movement, proclaimed Martin Luther King Jr. at Communist Training School. And you can kind of see the banner headline there. King's allies were outraged by the attempts to associate him with communism, and rightly so. A decade later, it was white supremacists who howled when King spoke out forcefully in a speech against the war in Vietnam, in which he connected and confronted what he called the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. But this time, King's allies were also highly critical of his speech in 1967, concerned that his focus on peace issues would only fuel the attacks on the civil rights movement as being communist-controlled. So what I want to argue is that the outrage sparked by Dr. King's Riverside Church speech is comprehended best when viewed through the lens of the Black and Red Scare that began half a century earlier. We all know that organizing for racial and economic equality was met with brutal violence, and that especially to the South, as one scholar says, race mixing and communism were two sides of the same coin. But I want to bring Black protest against US foreign policy into the picture, as well as reactions to African Americans who brought their concerns about injustice on the home front to an international audience. So I want to add those questions to organizing over race and economic equality. After the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and the founding of the Communist Party USA, a self-conscious and effective anti-communist network developed, and it shaped what I call a long and pervasive Black and Red Scare. In selecting its targets, this network did not concern itself with distinguishing actual communists from those they supposedly manipulated. And government agents and private citizens often worked in concert, characterizing Black protest itself as subversive, a threat to the established order. Suppression of African Americans who promoted equality and opposed war was common before the 20th century, of course, but that suppression became much more systematic during World War I. At that time, the Justice Department and the newly formed Federal Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover worked to silence those who spoke out against the war and the draft. And their fellow citizens attacked African Americans as wartime mobility increased expectations and competition. In East St. Louis, Illinois, the response to competition for jobs in war factories after the US had entered the war that was supposedly to make the world safe for democracy, the response in East St. Louis was a race riot. White mobs beat up and lynched Black people, set fire to homes, and shot people as they fled, killing them while police looked on, or in some cases encouraged the violence. The official death toll of what observers called the East St. Louis Race War was 48 people, 39 of whom were Black, but the actual numbers were probably higher. And many of the massacres I'm going to mention have official death tolls, but the real numbers are not often known. As in other 20th century race riots, local conditions and white mobs were responsible for the violence, but government agents and other observers blamed outside forces, especially communists, for inciting it. The response of people of color to these events set the tone for their critique of US military interventions to come. And they implored, Mr. President, why not make America safe for democracy? That was one of the signs they carried. So this is the planning for a silent march in Harlem that was a response to the events in East St. Louis. And you can see the call to march there and the explanation for why they march. And then this is a picture of the silent march in Harlem. But I want you to also note the slogans that people highlighted. So we have fought for the liberty of white Americans in 6 wars. Our reward was East St. Louis. And then make America safe for democracy. While most African Americans heeded W.E.B. Du Bois's call to close ranks and support the war effort, a call he later regretted, those who challenged the war faced persecution. African Americans were disproportionately prosecuted for draft evasion, and the FBI assumed they were particularly susceptible to enemy propaganda. Army intelligence agents worked with the Justice Department to pressure the most influential Black publications to mute criticism of the war. They succeeded in many cases, including with the Chicago Defender and The Crisis, but the publisher of the San Antonio Inquirer, who permitted an angry protest to be printed, was convicted under the Espionage Act and ended up serving a year in the federal penitentiary. President Wilson considered pacifist, socialist, and labor organizer A. Philip Randolph the most dangerous Negro in America. That was his phrase. And his attorney general sought to shut down Randolph's newspaper, The Messenger. And you can't, I don't know if you can see the masthead, but it says the only radical Negro magazine in America. And this is a quote from Randolph. Despite intense efforts to have them prosecuted, Randolph and his co-publisher Chandler Owens managed to spend only a few days in jail. Their publication did lose its second-class mailing permit for 2 years, however, and they faced constant surveillance. In defending African-American opposition to World War I, Randolph succinctly explained that Black people faced a choice between, quote, being burnt by Tennessee, Georgia, or Texas mobs, or being shot at in war. The experience of Bishop Charles Harrison Mason, who founded a pacifist church at the end of the 19th century, illustrates the limited options Black people faced. The FBI and military intelligence investigated, interrogated, and eventually arrested Mason on conspiracy charges for his opposition to the war and the draft. In one somewhat ironic instance, the sheriff in Lexington, Mississippi, arrested him for obstructing the draft only in order to keep him from being lynched by a local white mob. For those African Americans who did fight in the war, the radicalizing experience of serving in a Jim Crow army fueled rising expectations and a determination to achieve genuine equality. People organized to fight back against racial violence at home, but those efforts again led to increased repression. The Red Scare that began during the war took on new momentum in the second half of 1918 as pro-Bolshevism replaced pro-Germanism as a major concern of government agencies. The FBI set the tone for the next half century, dismissing, in Theodore Cornwible's words, every Black dissident as subversive, every criticism of American policy as un-American. The FBI's outlook was widely shared by a growing anti-communist network that targeted recent immigrants and African Americans, and its greatest nightmare was an alliance of those two forces. Raising the specter of government overthrow while frequently resorting to vigilantism, official and unofficial forces of repression worked together to defend white supremacy. The summer of 1919 became known as Red Summer, mostly due to the amount of blood that was shed, but the political meaning of red also applies here. Though it was white mobs who brought on widespread racial violence that year, North and South, the FBI and the Justice Department blamed African Americans, who they charged had succumbed to Bolshevik propaganda. In the name of maintaining law and order, as so often happens, and fostering 100% Americanism, a local American Legion post in Arkansas employed horrific violence to put down what it was determined to perceive as a Black insurrection. The Legion organized armed posses to destroy the Hoopspur Lodge of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union. This lodge was a group of poor Black sharecroppers whose stated goal was, quote, to advance the interests of the Negro morally and intellectually, and to make him a better citizen and better farmer. If that sounds subversive to you, I think maybe you're missing something. White men attacked a meeting of the lodge on September 30th, 1919, slaughtering people as they tried to flee and hide. The result was a massacre of hundreds of Black men, women, and children. And all of this is kind of reminiscent of what happened after Nat Turner's rebellion back in 1831. So there's a long tradition of this kind of slaughter and violence. The difficulty of defending Black communities against arbitrary violence and injustice was also clearly evident in the race riots that engulfed several cities in the 1920s. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, white mobs burned to the ground one of the wealthiest Black neighborhoods in the country, killing hundreds of men, women, and children while leaving thousands homeless. Instability caused by wartime migration, local conditions, the increasing militancy of African Americans helped lead to white violence. But again, government agents blamed communism. And in fact, this time they sort of reversed cause and effect, because it was actually those riots that brought the communists in to try to organize people. Terror remained a fact of life for those who organized in the South during the Depression decade of the 1930s, when American communism reached its strongest point. Communists, as Robin Kelley has illustrated, gave Southern Blacks a vantage point from which to critique society, understand the roots of poverty and racism, and connect local struggles to world politics. The 1931 Scottsboro case, in which 9 young Black men were falsely accused of raping 2 white women on a train in Alabama, was an important turning point. The communist legal defense and mobilization of public opinion around what they called the Scottsboro Boys, not because they called Black people boys, but because they were so young. Their mobilization convinced many African Americans that the Communist Party was the most militant and effective force for racial justice. This belief, grounded in a global anti-fascist perspective, led a number of Black leftists to volunteer in Spain with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade to fight fascism. There they could fight in unsegregated units and even serve as officers, unlike in the US Army. They were also feeling like they could avenge Mussolini's attack on Ethiopia and become part of what they saw, in Kelley's words, as a larger fight for justice and equality that would inevitably take place on US soil. Many of these men had personally experienced the terror that met those who tried to organize the unemployed and were willing to risk their lives fighting Franco, who, like Mussolini and Hitler, was representative of their oppressors at home. They didn't all make it back, but for those who did, anti-communism and racism continued to haunt them. The FBI harassed them, the State Department revoked their passports, and they were still refused service, even at times in the North. On his first night home in New York, the hotel where his comrades were staying denied James Yates a room because he was Black. Yates was shocked by how quickly he had to face the contrast with his welcome in Spain. And he said, "The pain went as deeply as any bullet could have done. I had the dizzy feeling I was back in the trenches again. But this was another front. I was home." Black Lincoln Brigade members faced further persecution when they tried to enlist to fight in World War II. They were among those labeled premature anti-fascists, my favorite phrase in American history. What's a premature anti-fascist? Someone who was anti-fascist before the US government decided fascism was a threat. As Kelly points out, they were hounded by military intelligence and punished by their superior officers because they had gone to Spain, while they faced racial segregation, relegation to menial tasks, and verbal and physical assaults from fellow white servicemen. Those who came back and joined the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade paid a further price. The Dees Committee, which was the predecessor to the House Committee on Un-American Activities, labeled the veterans group a communist front. And this led some members to lose their jobs and even to get barred from unions that they had helped to build. But concerns about Black disloyalty went far beyond Lincoln Brigade veterans during World War II, as African Americans again pointed out the contradictions of fighting for democracy in a segregated army while lacking basic rights at home. The FBI monitored the Black press, including big concerns about the Double V campaign, Victory Abroad and at Home. And the government also used the draft as a weapon to take Black activists away from organizing on the home front. This also happened during the Vietnam War, but it happened in World War II as well. One little known story is that of John Kinloch, who was being groomed by his aunt, Charlotta Bass, to take over as editor of her progressive Black newspaper, the California Eagle. There's evidence that Kinloch was drafted because of his radical politics, and Bass believed the aim was to destroy the paper, and I think the evidence points that way. Once he was in the Army, Kinloch, who had hoped to be a war correspondent, leaped at the opportunity when he heard he could volunteer to fight with the 1st Integrated Regiment. He saw it as an expression of the struggle for racial equality that would surely continue when the war ended. And this is from a letter he wrote to his mother in November 1944. "Our children will live the tomorrow that their parents could only dream. They will because none of us shall fail to continue the struggle, even when this fighting here is done." And he's very idealistic. He wrote lots of letters from the war. But he wrote this letter to his mother shortly before he was killed in combat. And after her nephew's death in the war, Charlotta Bass increased her devotion to peace issues. She was active in the 1948 third-party presidential campaign of Henry Wallace, attracted to its platform of peace and civil rights, which itself became a target of anti-communists and white supremacists. After being forced to sell the Eagle a few years later, Bass served as the Communist Party 1952 vice presidential candidate, and that afforded her opportunities to give speeches criticizing the Korean War and racial and economic inequality. Black GIs in World War II faced violence even before they went overseas. White citizens near army bases where basic training took place harassed and attacked them, their uniforms alone often seen as an affront to Southern mores. But the worst riot of the era took place in Detroit, Michigan, a northern city that had its own Scottsboro in the 1930s, and where communists actively organized for fair housing and employment. Nativist and white supremacist groups such as the Black Legion and the Ku Klux Klan were active in Detroit as well, intent on stamping out communism. As white workers protested, working and living next to the African Americans who poured in to take advantage of wartime job opportunities, organizations defending Black rights boomed. As in the South, local whites refused to acknowledge problems of segregation and discrimination and blamed outside agitators for Black discontent. The predictions that Detroit was a powder keg failed to bring action to prevent the racial violence that took place in 1943 that left at least 34 dead and 700 injured, the majority of them Black. The race war extended overseas as well. John O'Killen's novel, And Then We Heard the Thunder, ends with the relatively unknown story of the battle that took place between Black and white US troops in Australia toward the end of the war. He's a Georgia writer whose papers are actually here at Emory. And this is towards the end of the novel. He's literally crying over the bodies of his slain buddies after this race war. And he says, "I will always hate war with all my heart and all my soul. I will always fight the men who beat the drums for war in the name of holy patriotism in any nation, any language." And I think his story adds important emotional depth to Kimberly Phillips' claim that, quote, "the efforts of African Americans to withstand the violence within the military were as significant as their efforts to endure the horrors of combat." In the aftermath of the war, African American veterans were singled out for vicious racial assaults. In 1946, as many of you probably know, 2 Black farm couples in Monroe, Georgia, including a decorated war veteran and a woman 7 months pregnant, were ambushed, dragged from their car, and shot to death. The FBI later investigated whether Georgia Governor Eugene Talmadge had sanctioned the murders for political purposes. Talmadge visited Monroe not long before the lynching and just 2 days before the Democratic gubernatorial primary, the first one in which Blacks were able to vote. During his campaign, Talmadge, whose racism and anti-communism had already been on display during 3 terms as governor, used this rhetoric to great effect. He promised to bring back the white primary, which the Supreme Court had ruled against in 1944, in his words, unfettered and unhampered by radical communist and alien influences. Black voting, in his view, was informed by outsiders. And, quote, "the people of Georgia must declare whether or not they will continue to run the state, or whether they are willing to turn it over to Moscow Harlem zoot suiters." If we tweak the rhetoric a little bit, we get to today, which I will show you at the end. The echoes are a little strong right now. As the Red Scare reached its height in the early 1950s, government agencies and citizens concerned about 100% Americanism harshly persecuted African American communists, as rising Black expectations coincided with the Communist Party's focus on criticizing US foreign policy and promoting peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. After bringing a petition to the United Nations in 1951, charging the US with the genocide of African Americans, William Patterson had his passport revoked by the State Department. Henry Winston, Ben Davis, James Jackson, and Claudia Jones were among the Communist Party leaders convicted under the Smith Act for allegedly conspiring to advocate the overthrow of the government. And you need to get the phrase conspiring to advocate. The Smith Act was later declared unconstitutional because what it really made illegal was having a conversation with someone about something you didn't like. In the meantime, Jones was deported. Winston suffered serious health problems that went unattended while he was in prison. Van Davis was ordered to mop floors after protesting racial segregation in prison. And James Jackson's family was subject to surveillance during the nearly 5 years he was in hiding. The FBI went so far as to coerce their 4-year-old daughter's nursery school to expel her. The most influential and visible targets were W.E.B. Du Bois, arguably the leading Black intellectual in the country, and Paul Robeson, a well-known international concert singer and activist. The Justice Department invoked the McCarran Act, the other legal pillar of the Cold War Red Scare, and indicted Du Bois for his leadership of the Peace Information Center, which, among other suspicious activities, circulated the Stockholm Peace Petition calling for a ban on atomic weapons. Du Bois's refusal to turn over membership lists and register the Peace Information Center as the agent of a foreign power, presumably the Soviet Union, earned him the government's wrath. And this is part of what led him down the path that eventually had him leaving the US for Ghana. Paul Robeson became the touchstone for un-Americanism, especially after his speech at the 1949 World Conference of Intellectuals for Peace, in which he suggested that African Americans would not go to war, even against the Soviet Union, on behalf of a government that failed to extend democracy at home. And this is one of his very famous quotes, which we'll see echoed by activists in the 60s and 70s. And I note that Georgia keeps coming up, so I don't know whether to apologize for that or just tell you that Georgia is kind of at the center of a lot of this story. A few months after that 1949 speech, Robeson faced violent attacks when he tried to give a concert at Peekskill, New York. A group of veterans barricaded roads, burned the platforms, chairs, songbooks, and programs, and beat up people who made it into the concert grounds. And if I have time, I was going to show you a video clip of some of what happened there. Let's see if it works. So you could hear the racial epithets as well as go back to Russia. And you can see the violence and how the police don't do anything to stop it and sometimes participate. Despite all sorts of eyewitness testimony to the contrary, a grand jury investigation of Peekskill concluded that communists were to blame for the violence. The House Committee on Un-American Activities held hearings aimed at discrediting Paul Robeson, and the government denied his passport for the next 8 years, destroying his career and his health. Government agencies targeted a long list of African-American activists and artists who shared Robeson's and Du Bois' global perspective on Black rights and their critique of US Cold War policies. And the experience of these people ranged from FBI surveillance and harassment to arrest, jail time, and exile, all of which took a toll on their mental and physical health. Non-communists and even anti-communists felt the consequences of the Red Scare as well, and some chose exile rather than try to function in the repressive atmosphere of the 1950s. Black pacifist Bill Sutherland, a World War II conscientious objector, felt so stifled in the US that he spent several decades in Ghana working in the anti-nuclear movement and for the cause of Black liberation. Bayard Rustin and St. Clair Drake shared Sutherland's nonviolent, anti-colonial outlook, and their work in the peace movement in Africa also earned them attacks from several quarters. So no matter their relationship to communism, all of these Black activists paid a price for their refusal to accept what Kevin Gaines calls the Cold War assumption that solidarity with African peoples in their struggles for independence was tantamount to disloyalty. Even in the 1960s, when the Red Scare had supposedly subsided, federal agencies obsessed with subversive activity continued to single out African Americans who criticized US foreign policy. Good examples come from the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a short-lived yet influential effort to combat US government propaganda about the Cuban Revolution. One of the founders of Fair Play, Richard Gibson, was African American, and he was joined by a number of other people of color who saw connections between the struggle for racial equality in the US and the Cuban Revolution. And I don't know if you can see on the ad in the New York Times, James Baldwin, Frank London Brown, John Henrik Clark. There was a very substantial group of African Americans in Fair Play for Cuba. One of the founders, Gibson was the first Black writer for CBS News, and his goal was to get the American public to understand the Cuban Revolution clearly enough to support diplomatic efforts. For his efforts in that regard, Gibson was forced to resign from his job, barred by the INS from leaving the country, subpoenaed to appear before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and ordered to produce lists of Fair Play members, chapters, and student councils. Gibson told the Senate committee that Fair Play was, quote, not a communist operation, whatever that may be, but that he had no intention of inquiring into the political beliefs of its members. Gibson also denied that he was a communist, adding that the color of his politics was not red, but black. The FBI, state, and Justice Departments cooperated to limit Fair Play for Cuba's influence. They shadowed members, denied them passports, and planted stories to discredit their views. They took a special interest in William Worthy, who had traveled to Cuba without a passport as a correspondent for the Baltimore Afro-American. Worthy had been a CO in World War II, and like Bayard Rustin, a pioneer in the nonviolent direct action tactics adopted by the civil rights movement. The State Department confiscated Worthy's passport after he traveled to communist China in the 1950s, and yet he spent 11 weeks in Cuba in 1961. Several months later, he was charged with re-entering the country without a passport, a charge his supporters claimed had never been used to prosecute a white person. Worthy was eventually convicted and sentenced to prison, a conviction later overturned on constitutional grounds. Worthy also was not a communist, but he had pointed out US hypocrisy in calling for free elections in Cuba. And this is what he wrote: that vicious enemy of Cuba and of Negroes, Senator James Eastland, represents the state of Mississippi, where there has not been a free election for 65 years. Government agents took more extreme actions as the Black Power movement became more explicitly anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist in the late 60s. The groundwork was laid by programs dubbed Racial Matters and Commonfil, meaning communist infiltration, which kept FBI agents busy searching for communist influence in racial matters. And their particular focus was on Martin Luther King's associations and plans. Once Dr. King spoke out forcefully against the Vietnam War in 1967, some moderate forces in the civil rights movement joined the fierce criticism of King, despite the fact that his speech included the obligatory statements opposing communism. These attacks were predictable, since young Black activists had caused an uproar 2 years earlier when they publicly questioned the Vietnam War, connecting their opposition to it with the struggle for racial equality at home. In Macomb, Mississippi, where civil rights activism had been met with white terror for several years, a group of African Americans in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party spoke out after they heard that a former classmate of theirs had been killed in combat in Vietnam. Excuse me. Their July 1965 statement argued, as you can see, that no Blacks in Mississippi should be fighting for the white man's freedom until African Americans in Mississippi were free. Negro boys should not honor the draft here in Mississippi. Mothers should encourage their sons not to go. While this statement resonated with many young Black people, it created a firestorm both within and outside the civil rights movement. Liberal newspaper editor Hodding Carter III accused the MFDP of, quote, collaborating with the communist line, and called the statement close to treason. The FBI and Selective Service scrutinized civil rights activists who linked their work to the war, including conscientious objectors such as John Lewis and Bob Moses. The state legislature in Georgia fought to unseat civil rights activist Julian Bond from his elected position because of his opposition to the war, but also the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's opposition. So this is part of SNCC's statement on the Vietnam War. SNCC's call for resistance against the draft and for creating, quote, a draft for the freedom fight in the United States as an alternative to the military draft, brought increased surveillance and harassment from the government, which continued to draft activists and imprison resistors. And those are the events that then set the stage for the controversy that erupts after Martin Luther King's speech at Riverside Church in Manhattan. And in that speech, he argued that the Vietnam War was an enemy of the poor. He pointed out what he called the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. And finally, he accused the US government of being, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. By then, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee was holding public hearings on what it called subversive influences behind the urban riots. The FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, which began in the 1950s to undermine the Communist Party, then turned its attention to what it called Black nationalist hate-type organizations. And in that list of organizations, among others, was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. By 1969, Hoover and the FBI were focused on the Black Panther Party, which they called the #1 threat to the internal security of the United States. The House Committee on Internal Security held hearings that year, explaining that the focus of their investigation was in part to determine whether local Panther chapters were, quote, controlled, directed, or assisted by organizations or individuals seeking to overthrow the United States government, and whether any foreign communist powers provided direction or aid. Committee members questioned witnesses, including former participants, about the Panthers' 10-point program, among other things, and they were obviously drawn to the anti-capitalism, but also the point that Black men should be exempt from military service. And you can see they're making the same arguments as the MFDP at SNCC and so on. But they didn't just ask about the 10-point program. They also asked about programs the party had developed to provide services to the community, from health clinics to free breakfast for children. The FBI characterized the free breakfast program in particular as nefarious activity and a propaganda tool used by the party to carry out its communist agenda. Yes, feeding children before they go to school, nefarious activity. The police worked with the FBI to arrange and carry out the murder of Fred Hampton, the 21-year-old leader of Chicago's Panther chapter, who was assassinated as he lay in bed in the early morning hours of December 4th, 1969. Government officials and white supremacists continued to blame efforts to achieve racial equality on communists into the 1970s. After 6 Black men were shot in the back in Augusta, Georgia, during a riot there, Governor Maddox visited the city and blamed the violence on a communist conspiracy, as well as charging the Black Panthers with responsibility. At the same time, a vigilante group calling itself Rights of White People in Wilmington, North Carolina, threatened to use violence in order to suppress what they called the communist-inspired Black revolutionaries, who they blamed for racial strife in that city. More than 4 decades later, in late 2017, a similar group charged that the communist government of Charlottesville, Virginia, was denying them permission to hold a rally there. Those charges by Unite the Right, which had rallied in Charlottesville a few months earlier, violently attacking counter-protesters and killing one of them, illustrate the staying power of anti-communist impulses and rhetoric. It's hardly surprising that opponents of Black Lives Matter accuse it of being a subversive organization. To this day, white supremacist defenders of the status quo insist on putting the question of loyalty at the center when African Americans raise issues of racial oppression. The response to professional football player Colin Kaepernick's refusal to stand for the national anthem at a game in 2017 is highly revealing. His high-profile opponents, and you know who they were, stopped short of calling him a communist, but they successfully diverted the discussion into one about patriotism and the military. The threat of violence is clear in the t-shirts available on the internet showing Kaepernick in the crosshairs of a rifle. The successful diversion of the discussion from racial equality to patriotism and the violent threats and actions of emboldened white supremacists in our own time carry on a long counter-subversive tradition. In the 20th century, that tradition took the form of an anti-communist network that carried out a Black and red scare, blending suspicions of Black disloyalty with fears of communist agitation to justify persecution of African Americans and to defend structures and policies rooted in racism, economic inequality, and militarism. And finally, lest we think that red baiting is a thing of the past, okay, I hate to turn down Marvin Gaye, but I drive my students crazy because I make them actually listen to music without looking at videos and whatever to go with it. It's the way we used to listen to music. So I ended with that song for a reason, though. Does anybody know the story behind the recording of that song? Marvin Gaye's brother fought in the Vietnam War and came back and told Gaye these horror stories about what had happened there. So Marvin Gaye wrote this song and really wanted to record it. And Berry Gordy, who was the head of Motown at the time, said, "What are you trying to do, kill your career?" But somehow he managed to get it recorded, and as you all know, it became a huge hit. So it's another way of illustrating some of the things I'm trying to talk about. This obviously is rather current. One of the people who works with me keeps getting these flyers in the mail because her neighborhood is targeted. But when I saw Comrade Abrams, I said, okay, there's the end of my talk. Okay, I'm done. Thank you very much.